Avdiivka has fallen. There may be some skirmishes and some continued fighting over the next few days, but the matter has been settled tactically. It's over. Unfortunately, the strategic situation may also be settled, even though there will be more fighting to come. In let's see, I believe it was May of 2022, I wrote a series of articles toward the beginning of the war where I laid out in detail how Ukraine could overcome the advantages of the Russian side to at least have a good chance. And those things included how to stabilize the line of contact where it was at the time, how to build combat power out of contact at the time, substantial combat power, and then what they would have to do to buy time for that force to succeed. Basically, the gist was you have to hold the line while you build combat power out here. And I told the hard truth that it takes a long time to build combat power. You can't do it in 4 or 5 months. You can't get a bunch of stuff on the fly, which is what they ended up doing. But I said, you need to spend 12 to 18 months having this force completely dedicated to way outside, on the far western side of the country, to build the training, to have the logistic systems, to get the coherent units, to get backup stuff, to get spare parts, fuel, ammunition, all this stuff stockpiled up there so that you could bring this in as a powerful fist at a time and place of your choosing once they were ready. Now, to get to there, I said, listen, you're going to have to do some things that are painful and unpleasant. You're going to have to conduct what's known as a fighting withdrawal. And by doing that, you provide multiple bands of defense. And specifically what I wrote was that before any of these particular retrograde operations might be contemplated, it is important to prepare the fallback position ahead of time. The UAF, that's the Ukrainian Armed Forces, would be wise to begin immediately planning and resourcing the creation of a new line of defense 30 more kilometers to the west of their rearmost defensive positions. Subsequently, I went on to talk about there would be multiple belts that would be done. The UAF troops would only move to the new defensive lines if the Kiev force commander concluded that the Russians would surround them if the Ukrainians remained in place. While it sounds heroic and brave to suggest the UAF fight to the last, such a move would put at risk the entire country's ability for security. That's what I said at the time. And if they had done that, there would have been no guarantee, which I said at the time, but that would have given them a valid, legitimate shot at pushing the Russians back from where they were. Unfortunately, as we know, that's not what they did. Nobody wanted to wait that amount of time. They wanted to get in, try to launch this offensive as soon as they possibly could. And they didn't spend the time to build anything outside of contact in any large numbers. In fact, they did it piecemeal. Instead of what I suggested was a cohort, a whole unit, they sent some to Poland, some to Germany, some of the other countries there. So they had different levels of training. And some of them were literally only a few weeks or a month or two. So nobody got the kind of training that was necessary to build combat power. And of course, mostly they didn't get the equipment set, the full equipment set that was necessary. So they met the expected results when they hit the ground starting in June of last year. Now then, we're where we are here because they didn't do that then. And now then they suffered extraordinary losses, especially in Bakhmut. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. Now then they came to this next big area here of Avdiivka. Now, if they had done what I suggested, and it's not just me, many military people have suggested that they needed to be spending lots of time building subsequent defensive lines. Zaluzhny, who was the fired commander, actually many times last fall adamantly argued on Ukrainian media that they needed to stop the offensive, go to the defensive, and start building these defensive positions then. And we're talking like October, November of last year, so that they would be ready for a Russian offensive potentially in the spring. Well, as it turned out, Russia didn't wait till the spring. They're doing it now. Because they didn't do that then, now then they don't have these fallback positions. So Avdiivka has fallen, and that's going to be a problem. But there's a bigger problem involved because they haven't done the hard work necessary to move to next positions. They do have some positions they've been working on, but they're nowhere near ready. And as we're about to see, Russia is not like they were earlier in 2023 when they took Bakhmut. They're in a much more powerful position to do more. But there's yet another level of problem for the Ukrainian side is there is complete chaos at the top of their strategic and operational fronts. So 2 days ago, 2 days ago, you had the president of Ukraine talk about the fighting in Avdiivka, and see if you heard the word withdrawal or surrender anywhere in his comments.
A report by Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrsky and Defense Minister Rustem Umerov. The situation on the front line, Avdiivka and the East in general. We are doing everything we can to ensure that our warriors have enough managerial and technological capabilities to save as many Ukrainian lives as possible. I also signed several decrees on new replacements in the Ukrainian Defense Forces, more combat experience of this war, more modern approaches.
But instead, all of a sudden, we find now 48 hours later that Syrsky actually last night, Washington time, and early in the morning on Saturday in Ukraine, announced that they're going to conduct a withdrawal and that they're abandoning the city out of nowhere. There's no preparation for that, no comments. All of a sudden, now they're withdrawing. He claims, well, because I want to protect my people. Now, on the surface, that's something that would have made sense, but not at that point. But as Military Summary Channel discusses here, probably didn't happen quite that way.
It's very probable that Syrsky didn't announce the withdrawal willingly, but was forced after seeing that Ukrainians were refusing to follow orders and start abandoning their positions in panic. So that was not like the things that came from the top. That was the situation that the Ukrainians took a decision to do by themselves, to surrender and to run away and to run for their lives, because nobody was planning to, let's say, evacuate them or gave any support.
Now, you may recall that actually one day ago, maybe 2 days ago, it was reported, first reported that the Ukraine, that Syrsky had sent the 3rd Assault Brigade, the Azov, one of the Azov brigades, to try and push back the Russians to hold the city, because that's what their intent was. They wanted to hold Avdiivka. I understand the sentiment, they want to hold it, but the military conditions on the ground, the reality, the truth, made it exceptionally clear that they were not going to hold it for many, many reasons, some of which I'll touch on in just a second. But they were blind to that, and they just went with what their heart told them that they wanted to, aside from what a cold-hearted analysis of the military reality screamed, and they tried to do that. But then, of course, it didn't work. Now then, the city has indeed fallen. Here's the big problem. Because they were so focused on doing the militarily unattainable of holding Avdiivka, they sacrificed the entire brigade and many others to try and hold what couldn't be held, instead of preparing positions more ardently to the west to defending it, so that they would have somewhere to fall back onto that they could then put in a good defense. But as another one of these really good mappers here, Weeb Union, points out, now then there's even more trouble, because in 2022, when Russia came in, they came in with about 200,000 troops. And as I've said many times, that was not enough to conquer even the eastern part of Ukraine. And so that was a big problem there. Russia has learned a lot in the last 2 years of war. And now you'll see that instead of what they had in 22, they've now got triple that number.
So this will be a two-stage operation. The first stage includes the northern and western parts, and the second stage includes this further to the west. This is all possible due to the fact that the Russians got this city that quickly. The Ukrainians surrendered without much of a fight. At the end of it, this means that the Russians still have enough energy and so on to continue fighting without an operational pause, as we saw previously. Whenever the Russians would capture an area, they would do an operational pause. However, the main reason for that, despite the differences in situations and so on, is that the Russians now have a significant amount of manpower. The reported 600,000 troops on the Russian side allows them to continue this fight even after months of fighting. This means that they simply rotate units out whenever they get tired. As such, the Russians are able to continue their operations without holding these operational pauses, which we saw when the Russian army was 200,000 or less at the front line.
That really came into effect in, I think it was January or February of 2022, when Bakhmut fell, after the Wagner group had been spending, I think, 9 months to take that city, when again, the Ukraine side refused to give it up and literally forced the Russian side to wrest every single building out of their fingers, so then that they, were not able to save their troops. They, again, put all kinds of reserves to try to hold it. Zelensky famously said, "This is Fortress Bakhmut. We are not going to give it up." And then, of course, they were forced to do so. Problem for the Russians at that time is that they only had maybe 200,000, 250,000 troops, and they had just mobilized 300,000, but they weren't trained. They weren't prepared. So Russia had no operational capacity to make good on that, and they basically just froze the line right there, Bakhmut. Now then they have somewhere, by multiple reports, of somewhere around 600,000 troops in the area. And they have now had a long, almost a year to train. It sounds familiar. That's kind of what I was suggesting the Ukraine side should have done in the past. And by the way, in case for anybody who's interested in seeing that 3-part series, I've included links in the description. You can go read that at your good pleasure. But so the situation now is very dire tactically and operationally for Ukraine because they don't have good positions to the west. Russia does appear to have multiple, whole brigades ready to go and to be able to operationally exploit this. It remains to be seen whether they'll be able to do that. Many people are skeptical of their capacity to have exploitation warfare. It's something they haven't done very good so far, but we're going to see because they certainly have the ammunition, the drones, the air power, the air defense, etc. And now it looks like they also may have the manpower. Whether they're fully trained or trained enough remains to be seen. They have to prove that on the battlefield. But the situation is definitely dire because the Ukraine side is reeling now. They have all this political and division at home. They have the division between they lost their popular commander with Zaluzhny. Now then there's a guy that they don't really trust who said he was going to hold the city, and 2 days later it's gone. So you see that their confidence is shaken. That's not a good place to start a warfare. Now, how's that looking in the West? Because the name of this article here is that, or this segment here is that Avdiivka has fallen, and one of our worst case scenarios could be playing out, or it could be unfolding that Putin could win and emerge from this war stronger than he was at the beginning. Everything about what we've said in the West so far has been that we're going to weaken Russia, and we're okay if this turns into a stalemate and goes a long term because that works in our favor. Russia will continue to be weakened, and that helps our security. That's an absurd position that I've said from the beginning, but that's what people want to do. Well, now then, there's the increasing probability that the opposite turns out and that Russia will emerge stronger diplomatically, economically, if you can imagine that, and militarily, even on the ground. So the opposite of what we wanted to accomplish. And I assure you, folks, everybody else around the world is watching this. And I usually roll my eyes when I hear people say, if we don't get tougher on fill in the blank, Iran, North Korea, China, whatever, people will view us as weak and they'll exploit it. Let me tell you what's really the danger. If we try to talk tough and we try to act tough and then we get a bloody nose and knocked back, that's what will undercut your credibility. So when you make claims that you don't have checks to write, as many people like to say, that's where you lose credibility and actually put your own self at risk and your interest at risk. And now we're going to see why that is. So we're going to start off looking at the Munich Security Conference. It was either yesterday or the day before. We had somebody we like to bring on a lot because he always provides great operations and sound bites. Ben Hodges was in Munich. And instead of recognizing what I've just showed you, and instead of saying, hey, we're really concerned about this and, the situation is dire, he says this.
I don't agree that the Russians have the upper hand. Neither side can knock out the other. The Russians do not have the ability to finish off Ukraine. After 10 years, with every advantage, Russia still only controls 18% of Ukraine. The Black Sea Fleet is losing in the Black Sea. The great Russian Air Force is terrified of flying over Ukraine. Russia has lost 500,000 soldiers killed and wounded and thousands of armored vehicles. I think Russia actually is in a very fragile state.
That just defies logic, especially that last part there, that Russia is in a very fragile state. Russia has spent the majority of the last year building combat power out of contact, which I recommended that's what the Ukraine side did, that's what the West would support because that made sense. Now it's looking like they're ready to employ that combat power, and they just took a fairly major city in Avdiivka. Tactically or operationally speaking, it's fairly important. More than the tactical utility of what's on the ground is the psychological impact that has on defeating and pushing back the Ukrainian side and getting lots of confidence to the Russian side because the fundamentals from this point forward favor the Russians and do not favor the Ukraine side. So that's why it's not just a psychological deal. It's a legit issue of grave concern, should be. But you see, Hodges has his head in the sand. And unfortunately, that's nothing new for him. Now, imagine after 2 years of war and all that you've seen that's unfolding as we're speaking right now, imagine him saying this 2 years ago.
This murder, deliberate targeting of civilians is designed to put so much pressure on the West, as well as on the Zelensky government, in hopes that somebody will finally crack. But this war of attrition takes three things: endless amounts of time, endless amounts of ammunition, and endless amounts of people. And they don't have any of those three. They're going to run out of time because sanctions are eventually going to really take effect, both internally and externally. Their ammunition stocks are already running low, particularly of the preferred munitions, and they have a manpower shortage. Russian forces are not as numerous as Ukrainian forces.
What the hell is he talking about? Russian forces are not as numerous as Ukrainian forces? Russia, which has tens of millions more people than the Ukraine side does? What is he talking about? But that's what passes for serious analysis on the Western side among the elite. So with that kind of basis, you can see, okay, if you're listening to this guy, I can see why we've got trouble. And time is not on Russia's side, and the ammunition is running out. Folks, that was 2 weeks into the war when he made that statement. And Russia's running out of ammunition. And now then you see, for very predictable reasons, some of which I'm about to touch on, Russia has a substantial improvement and advantage in weapons and armament and ammunition in particular. But you didn't need to know anything about the future. You could have, from that moment, said the capacity of Russia is overwhelmingly greater than anything Ukraine can bring to bear. You should never have thought that Russia would run out of time, people, or ammunition, and yet that's what he said. But that was a common thing, because one of the things he mentioned there was the sanctions issue. And that was one of the big issues that so many in the West were gloating about, how they're going to destroy the Russian economy. And you had people like Fiona Hill say this.
We are seeing now with the sanctions and the cutting off of Russia from the economy, a huge blow to the Russia that Putin has built up since 2000 in his period in the presidency. Russia is going to go into a very steep recession. Many of the gains that the Russian economy and the Russian population as a result made over the last 22 years, since the dislocations and the wrenching rapid deindustrialization of the 1990s, are going to be lost.
Wow. So, man, they're going to go into a severe recession, and everything that they have built since the 1990s is going to be lost, and they're just going to collapse. And man, there could be an overthrow, which many other people said that Putin could be knocked out of power, and we could actually get regime change with this. How did that work out? Now, as a friend of our show, Cyrus Jensen, we had him on a little bit longer ago on his own show, showed us exactly how that's working out.
Last week, the Financial Times broke a story entitled "The Surprising Resilience of the Russian Economy." This article is a game changer because for the past 2 years, our media has only preached one consistent message: Russia is losing, Russia will be defeated, Russia is standing on its last leg. But economic data doesn't lie, and Russia's economic growth in 2023 surpassed that of all G7 countries. What's even more incredible is Russia's economy is now projected to continue this trend throughout 2024.
And why is that? What is one of the main reasons why? Is because Russia's not stupid. We consider that Russia was just stupid, that we would put some blocks on some things that they liked, that they didn't like. We would sanction other people to stop doing business with them, and everything would work. And bam, like Fiona Hill said, they would fall apart. But as it turns out, Russia's not stupid, and they found other ways to get past the sanctions and other buyers for their oil, as you see here.
India has been importing cheap Russian oil after the US imposed sanctions post-Russia-Ukraine war. In fact, Russia was the top oil supplier for India in the last few months, and time and again, Europe has imported Russian oil through India.
And now then you see that not only have they continued to have their economy going strong and they have that income revenue, now then they've increased their defense spending, and because they have a big advantage that Ukraine doesn't, they have this enormous military industrial complex that they have been working feverishly to expand for now 2 years. And it's virtually untouched because Ukraine doesn't have the long range missiles, the theater ballistic missiles, the new stuff like the Zircon, et cetera, that Russia has, because Russia's really knocking out all the factories that Ukraine has. They have to go underground in small little shops everywhere to try to do anything, especially with drones, where they are having some success, but they can't do it at scale. Russia, on the other hand, doesn't have this problem, as their ambassador to the UK says here.
I can assure you that our military industrial complex, which Ukraine doesn't have at all, it is now in full scale producing things which are needed for the front, let it be tanks or artillery, munition and all of that. And we do not need at all any foreign help or any assistance. We have sufficient capacities inside Russia to continue these things.
So every way you want to look at it, Russia has a revenue stream. They've moved closer with China. They've moved closer with North Korea, where even though their industrial capacity is growing in Russia, now they're also getting potentially up to 1, and depending on reports, maybe 2 million artillery shells on top of what they can create. They're getting drones from Iran that are growing closer with them. So all of the people that we don't like, all the people that we want to keep separate, are coming together. So that is another thing geostrategically that is weakening our position, because it's bringing our adversaries together. Prior to this war, those were all independent actors, and they didn't spend much time working together. They only had a little bit of support here and there. Now then, we're turning them into best friends in some cases. Not helpful for our side. The Russians have every expectation to continue fielding more and more men. Ukraine is trying their best to try to mobilize people, but they don't have enough money. They don't have enough resources to even bring people in. And because so many losses, far more than Russia has had, no matter what anybody wants to claim in the Western media, the evidence is very clear that the casualties on the Ukraine side are profound and much higher. And because it's from a smaller population pool, substantially bigger impact. And now then the people see this on the ground in Ukraine, and the last thing they want to do is get mobilized to go and fight what they view as a almost death sentence. So they are fighting left and right. Some of the recruiters that are mobilizing, that are supposed to go getting people in Ukraine, are actually being beaten, and some have been killed because they would rather risk that and flight than go to what they think is a near certain death sentence. So you see that everywhere you want to look, because on the other side of that, despite what Hodges claimed in 2022, Russians are still volunteering in large numbers, between 14 and 16,000 per month. So that's why that number has swelled up to 600,000 with only one mobilization a year and a half ago. So every way you want to look at this, things are going bad for the Ukraine side. And then the last piece is that we had John Kirby a couple of days ago when he was talking about Avdiivka might fall. He says that the reason is because we need to give more money.
Fighting is incredibly intense in the east, particularly in a city called Avdiivka. It's a city that we've talked about several times before. Unfortunately, we're getting reports from the Ukrainians that the situation is critical, with the Russians continuing to press Ukrainian positions every single day. Avdiivka is at risk of falling into Russian control. In very large part, this is happening because the Ukrainian forces on the ground are running out of artillery ammunition. Russia is sending wave after wave of conscript forces to attack Ukrainian positions, and because Congress has yet to pass the supplemental bill, we've not been able to provide Ukraine with the artillery shells that they desperately need to disrupt these Russian assaults.
Well, on the first point, that's just flat out wrong. The idea that if this $60 billion would have been released even back in September when it was first floated by the White House, that would somehow provide all these stocks of shells is just nonsense. I mean, the implication being that, look, you could just go to Costco if you had the cash, and you could buy a bunch of pallets of 155 millimeter shells and bam, put them up to the front line, and all of a sudden everything would change on the front line. There's no truth to that at all. Those shells don't exist. People are trying to make them in the West already at feverish rates. And the issue is constraints on production. It's not cash at this point. And so even if you release that, it's not going to make any difference. So he's wrong. It's not. But let's just take a look at that for a second about the money thing, because as anyone who's been paying any attention at all understands that there is a tremendous dispute on the Hill between both the Republicans and Democrats, as well as within the Republican Party itself, about whether we should have any money. And that's probably best exemplified by someone we've had on the show talking about this subject before, Senator Rand Paul.
Open the champagne, pop the cork. The Senate Democrat leader and the Republican leader are on their way to Kiev. They've got $60 billion they're bringing. I don't know if it'll be cash in pallets, but they're taking your money to Kiev. Now, they didn't have much time, really no time and no money to do anything about our border. We're being invaded. A literal invasion's coming across our border. 800,000 people came illegally in the last month, and all they had time to do in the Senate was get the money, get the cash pallets, load the planes, get the champagne ready, and fly to Kiev.
Okay, so a little over the top rhetorically, but you get his point. He's really trying to emphasize that he doesn't want a bunch of money going to Ukraine instead of money going to his border, because that same Senate bill stripped out any money for the United States border while they called it a U.S. national security bill. So that's what's causing a lot of the problems here. And of course, it's even worse on the House side. Zelensky at the Munich conference, as you can see on the screen there, was trying to talk to a bunch of already sold American politicians to try to encourage them to pass that money, because I mean, even though I can tell you it won't make any difference, he still wants it. And who's to blame him really for that? He wants the cash. But the problem is it's not the congressmen who are in that room. It's the ones who aren't there that he needs to be talking to. And it's very unlikely he's going to change the situation, because folks, they see the same thing that you and I do. They see that the $200 billion provided by the United States and Western Europe in the first 18 months of the war did nothing to change the outcome. It did not allow the Ukraine side to have an offensive. And then they lost hundreds of thousands of troops killed and wounded in the process. And if you can say 200,000 didn't move the needle, then by what rationale can you say that 60 billion now would tilt the change on the battlefield? I mean, it's illogical, it's irrational to think so. But yet you have this whole crew of the so-called foreign policy elite in our country and in the Western Europe, in addition, just are adamantly unwilling to look at reality. They don't want that outcome, so they're pretending it's not real. But you see, on the ground, the Russian soldiers are moving forward. They are in larger numbers, and the defenses further back to the west of the Ukraine side are not as good as the ones that they have had here. And it's literally possible that there could be a break or a fracture in the Ukrainian forces, and there could be large movements in. Again, I'm not predicting that because there's too many factors. I don't have enough information to be able to say if that is going to happen or not. And Russia still has to prove they can do large-scale maneuver, but certainly the fundamentals are there that would allow it. But in any case, there is no prospect that Ukraine is going to reverse this and start going the other direction, because now the balance of power is decisively tilted. So what does that mean strategically? We need to start taking a look at that, because there are some hard choices facing our country right now. If we continue to go forward, like Ben Hodges has, like some of these other leaders have, Zelensky, all of those leaders in Stoltenberg from NATO, Secretary of State Blinken, who just a few days ago just categorically said, yep, Ukraine is still coming in NATO. Everything that we've been wanting to do from the beginning is going to come through, even though Vladimir Putin expressly said that was one of the primary causes for them to go into Ukraine in 2022. As Stoltenberg himself admitted he knew was the cause of the war back in February of 2022. We're still trying to pretend those things aren't real, and that if we just keep going, that something will change magically. But it's not going to. The chances that Ukraine eventually loses on the battlefield are far higher now than they were even as I've been talking earlier this year. But now the chances of them losing is almost off the charts higher than the possibility of them even turning into a stalemate. So what is the consequence of that for Vladimir Putin? We went into this saying we wanted to weaken Russia. We wanted to destroy their economy. We wanted to weaken their military so that they would not be a threat to anyone. That's what we said. So they couldn't do this to anyone else. What has been the result? You now have a field army of somewhere around 600,000 troops poised to move further to the west inside Ukraine itself. That doesn't count the hundreds of thousands more that are still training and growing within Russia. You have a military industrial complex that is now starting to crank out large numbers of drones, artillery, high precision missiles, rockets, various classes of drones. Thousands of more men per month are coming in there. They're getting trained based on the successes that they've had in the past. Meanwhile, the Russian economy is growing at a faster pace than the United States economy, while Europe is anemic and Germany itself is in a recession. So Fiona Hill was claiming that these sanctions would cause Russia to go into a severe recession, and the opposite happened. The engine of European economy, Germany, went into recession instead. I mean, I'm sorry, can't you guys see what's going on in front of you? I'm talking to the elite in Washington, in Brussels, and in Paris, and in Berlin. Don't you guys see what's happening before your eyes? Everything is falling apart. Everything you stood for, everything you wanted to accomplish is almost happening the opposite. You are laying the groundwork for Russia to be seen as a much higher entity and a much more powerful entity politically, diplomatically, and economically than the West is. And I assure you, in the non-Western rest of the world, the global South, as many call it, and in Asia, they're paying attention to this. They're looking around and they're going, if I have to decide who I'm going to back and who I'm going to put my future in, is it going to be Russia, who's friends with China and with all these other places and has withstood everything that NATO and the West could onslaught them with, and now then they're coming out on top? Or do I want to go with the side, and look, they see what I've been telling you, the side that can't see reality, that's afraid to even look at what's going on and make any kind of rational decision? Who do you think they're going to follow? And if this line continues to move further to the west, then you have the prospect of literally militarily losing. Russia could say, I'm willing, and they have, by the way, they have said that they're willing to go on this for years if necessary. They have the capacity and they have the plan in place to do that, meaning even if they don't have a big breakthrough, they can continue to methodically push this line to the west until at some point they may be into Odessa. They may be able to literally take Kherson City, to take Kharkiv, possibly in a year or so to even threaten Kiev. And that's if it just stays methodical. If there is a breakthrough, any of those things could happen within months potentially. All those things are on the table right now. What's not on the table is reversing it. And the longer we go on and not pay attention to what's going on, not pay attention to reality, not acknowledging what's happening before our very eyes, then that is the risk that we take. What we must do now is something that the West hates to do, in America above all, especially our leadership, is to acknowledge reality, to acknowledge that what we've been doing is a catastrophic failure at the tactical, operational, and strategic levels, and dramatic changes need to happen. I would recommend that we get a new Secretary of Defense, that we get some other new leaders at key positions, both diplomatically and militarily, and say, all right, we're going to now change course and we're going to try and get this war over. We're going to seek the best negotiated settlement we can. That could include that the Senate and the House actually come together to pass some bill for Ukraine so that they'd allow them to defend themselves, to try and hold that line, to change their tactics, to do things that are building defenses and not even fantasizing about any offense, just to hold as much territory as they can, to make any forward progress by the Russian side very painful and costly, and then offer them the possibility of a negotiated settlement that would allow them to keep what they have at a lower cost, to make it palatable. So Putin, forget about whether you want to trust him or not. If you just say, hey, we can end the war, we can end the killing, and we can stop the bleeding of our territory to Russia, then because even what Putin's asking, which he did on that Tucker Carlson interview the other day, he didn't say he's looking for the abject surrender, the total surrender. He says he's looking for a negotiated end, and he wants neutrality to be part of that. So he's willing to let Kiev be in control of all the current territory and be neutral, which means that once an agreement is reached, then Ukraine can immediately have as many settlement or agreements with Western European countries as they want. They can continue to build up their forces. They can do all those things to defend themselves. They can turn that line of contact into, an impregnable defensive line. All those things are possible. So there is a choice right now where Ukraine doesn't have to surrender. They can take the hard road. They can eat some crow. They can see that, we're not going to accomplish what we wanted to, but we're going to keep control of a good chunk of our country so that we have a future. That's possible right now. If they don't take that path, if our country and our leaders keep like Hodges at that Munich Security Conference and pretend that everything is going to continue to be okay, and then the possibility of an actual surrender being forced upon Ukraine grows by the month. That's where we're at, folks. And I just hope, I know we talk a lot about what you can do. If you have any of these same kinds of thoughts, I urge you to write your congressman. I promise you, I used to work at a Senate office in the past, and I know that letters do matter to Congress people. Whoever your congressman, whoever your senator is, start writing them letters and tell them to stop doing stupid stuff that won't succeed. And if you can tell them to defend our border, that would be a good start, because that's something we should always do anyway. But don't send a bunch of money that is throwing it down the toilet, your tax dollars, your money, by the way, we're talking about, or else borrowing it from China, which is in some ways worse. That's what we're facing against. So I'm asking you to take his action, doing whatever you can. Hold our leaders' feet to the fire. Say, we're aware of what's going on. You may be blind to reality, but we're not. And pass this video on to anyone that you know, so that they also understand what's reality. Because what I'm showing you here, it's graphic. It's not just my opinion. There's graphic evidence to validate what I'm saying, which is in direct contradiction to what you're hearing from a lot of these senior leaders. Pass this around, like and subscribe, because we're going to stay on top of this as things develop and bring you more and more episodes like this, because we are unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the truth that you need to make sense out of your life around you. Be sure and join us on Monday at 11 a.m. We're going to have Doug McGregor back, who's going to be looking at kind of how things are shaking out over the first 2 years and what he thinks is coming next, and with his track record in battle and his knowledge and about military affairs. You definitely don't want to miss that. Thanks, and we will see you Monday on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.